Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to have you here today for our panel. I'm Dr. Malone from the Department of History, and I will be chairing what promises to be a very fascinating panel today. Our topic is Memory and War in the 20th Century. And before we get started, I'm going to tell you how we're going to proceed in our new world of conferencing. So our panelists will each make their presentation. And then when they're all done, I'll make a few comments about their work and pose some probing questions, I hope, to our panelists. And then after that, and this is what I want to emphasize, we are going to open up the floor for question and answers. And this will be opportunity for our audience to ask questions of our panelists. And we will do this through the Q&A function. So if you do have a question that you would like to pose, you can post it in the Q&A option. And then I will read the questions to our presenters, and then they'll have the opportunity to answer them. So let's get started today. Our first presenter is Lucas Cauley, and he is currently a student in our MA program in history. And I also have to add this in, he is an assistant editor of the Burkhardt Review. So that's a very interesting facet of his graduate career. His presentation is based on his paper entitled Politics and Patriotism, the Creation of the Indiana War Memorial. So without further ado, let me turn over the screen to Lucas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malone. I'm going to share my screen here so everyone can see the presentation. Move everything out of the way. All right, can everyone see? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about the creation of the Indiana World War Memorial in Indianapolis. On July 4th, 1927, there was seemingly normal parade in Indianapolis, downtown Indianapolis. Children were there perched on their parents' shoulders, watching bands march down the street, playing regular marching tunes. There were soldiers in uniform, active duty, as well as Indiana veterans from the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, National Guard service, and the recently concluded World War, marching down the street as well. It seemed to be a normal parade for everyone. I think a lot of people in rural Indiana can attest that this is how parades go in small towns. But what set this one apart is leading the parade was General John J. Pershing. He was the former commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Western Europe during the First World War. And he was highly respected, highly revered across the nation, one of the most prominent military figures of the day. And he was getting older at this point, but he was still very active in the public's eye. He was still an advisor to a lot of generals that people know today: Eisenhower, MacArthur, Patton. And like I said before, he led the parade right down the street. And now a lot of us might wonder, why would such a prominent figure in American history at this point come to Indianapolis for a regular Independence Day parade? This was an annual event. It was usually well attended, but Pershing left his family in Maine on Independence Day. His son and his two sisters traveled for the better part of a day to Indianapolis just to lead this specific parade. Now, why would he do that? And believe it or not, it wasn't to celebrate the president's recent 55th birthday. I know that might be surprising, especially to President Coolidge at the time. He actually was there to lay the cornerstone of the Indiana World War Memorial. And although the war had been over for roughly 8.5, almost 9 years at this point, it was still very fresh in the minds of the people of Indiana. Veterans, families who lost children, widows, children who lost parents. It hadn't gone away at this point. The Great Depression had not come. It wouldn't come for another 2 years. And obviously, fascism in Europe was on the rise, but not to the degree it would be over the next decade. So this conflict really was, at this point, still the war to end all wars. It was the Great War, the first modern conflict. It really took the memory away, not entirely, but it did take the memory away from the Civil War in Indiana, which was very, very well remembered, very well honored across the entire state. And it's surprising that such a prominent general would come to this state to lay the cornerstone for memorial. Memorials for the World War were being built across the country at this time, and to an extent across the world. The English were building monuments in France to their colonial soldiers, as well as their domestic soldiers at home. National cemeteries were springing up and had been springing up since the war ended. So why would he come to Indianapolis? Indiana's casualties for the war made up less than 3% of the nation's total. And while the state certainly displayed patriotism during the conflict, we don't think of it as standing out in the war effort. It was relatively average. And a lot of this patriotism for the parade and for this memorial comes from the Hoosier State's commemorative past. So Indianapolis residents were very familiar with the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. People still are today. It is a tourist attraction during the holiday season. It's decorated with lights, festivities go on. There's lots of active shops around it. Tourists come to take pictures every single year. And when you think of Indiana memorials, and specifically Indianapolis memorials, this is what comes to mind. But just a few blocks away is this vast memorial plaza, including the American Legion memorials, monuments to the First World War, Korea, Vietnam, and of course, World War I, which we'll be talking about. In this plaza, there was, prior to the Indiana World War Memorial, was the Indianapolis Marion County Public Library, which did have statues to James Whitcomb Riley and others on the front steps. And this was very prominent at the time. One of the earliest forms of World War commemoration that was supposed to take place was at this public library, actually. Paul Kret, an architect who would go on to build several monuments to the First World War in France and other areas of Europe, he first suggested that the state honor their World War veterans by placing Army and Navy statues around the Indianapolis Marion County Public Library. But it quickly became evident that this is not what the state wanted. The state wanted something far more grand and prominent to really show how much the state cared about what happened previously. And a lot of these ideas and questions surround memory and honor. How people at the time were asking, how can we remember what happened? Similar to what we are going through today, they knew very early that they had lived through a major historical event. This was the first modern war of the era. We saw the introduction of tanks, of biological warfare in the form of gases, machine guns. There were mass casualties in nations across Europe, and it left the continent utterly devastated. So it was no secret that this was going to remain a big deal and alter the face of politics and geography for some time. Laura Boudreau, a prominent historian of World War I memory, especially in the United States, writes that a lot of questions of memory and honor actually originated with the repatriation of war dead. So there are over 100,000 United States soldiers who perished in the conflict over in Europe at this time. And that is a huge number of burials and graves. And the government was faced with a task of, what do we do with all these soldiers? Do we return them home? Do we bury them in national cemeteries in the United States? Or do we bury them in national cemeteries across the ocean? And the public also faced a lot of these questions. So soldiers were coming home maimed. They were coming home with a lot of psychological trauma. We see the emergence of the study of PTSD. It was called shell shock at this time. And they didn't know what to do. How can you make right so many wrongs that had just happened? And obviously, Indianapolis's go-to move was to create a memorial. That is what they had done after the conclusion of the Civil War. and they gained a lot of national recognition for this action. And Indianapolis was thought of as this time as this commemorative hub. They thought that the nation looked to them for these patriotic endeavors. How were they going to commemorate this war? So the public viewed this far more than the government did as an expectation. Even during the war, it was expected that after it was concluded, we were going to build a massive memorial to honor what had happened. You can see the two images here. The one above is of a national cemetery that was built in France, and the one on the right was an unconfirmed victory celebration that actually happened a few days before the armistice was signed. And you can see that it takes place at the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in the Circle downtown. There was a great deal of politics and organizational efforts that took place to create this memorial. It wasn't just something that the government agreed upon. They didn't just recognize public opinion was in favor of this and then build a memorial. They actually were influenced heavily by private organizations and non-for-profit organizations such as the American Legion and the American War Mothers, who we will talk about later. The American Legion held their first conference in 1920, and they were formed just at the end of the war. There's actually talks of forming this organization during the war in 1918. It was led by three individuals: Walter Myers, Robert Moorhead, and Victor Keene. You can see an image of Keene on your screen, as well as a picture of the first convention. And this first convention was held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But right away, there was already talk that this was going to be a national organization, and that they had to spread it to the national level. And how could they go about doing that? Well, the three individuals that I just mentioned, they were the first to suggest that a national headquarters be built in Indianapolis. And this wasn't just a random location that they picked. Many individuals actually felt that it should be built in Washington, D.C., the capital of the country. Obviously, if they wanted to make a national name for themselves, they'd have to do it there. But these individuals recognized that Indianapolis was a patriotic center of the country, that there were already talks of building a memorial, although they were minor at this time, and they thought that they could obtain housing and a headquarters in a national memorial, a state memorial, if the state chose to build it. And they thought this would be a great way to house their organization. What better way to make a name for yourself than to claim your headquarters in a World War memorial? So it was a highly contested vote. Several states applied to have the organization headquartered in their capital cities. And after a great fight, Indianapolis actually won out. But the fight wasn't exactly over yet. Although the American Legion decided that they were going to build a headquarters there, the state hadn't decided that they were going to build a monument in the city yet. So the state government stepped in, recognizing public opinion. Governor James B. Goodrich, there's an image of him on your screen. He was in favor of the memorial. There was an election coming up, and he recognized public opinion was in favor of this. So it was pretty clear that he was going to support it. But several congressmen, state congressmen, and representatives did not favor a memorial being built. Not because they did not want to honor the veterans who had served, but because they did not like where it was being proposed to be built. It was going to be built downtown. There were already buildings there. It would have been a very expensive, at the time, $2 million endeavor to tear down these structures and to build the World War Memorial. Now, a few stepped up and said, we are not in favor of this, including Lou Shank. And it did not go well for him. He was raked over the coals in newspapers across the state and the country. The public could not believe that a representative from the state was going to be so unpatriotic in their eyes and disrespect the returning veterans and the war dead by opposing the memorial. The opposition didn't last long. It was mainly a location and funding issue. And the public made it very clear they were not having any of it. And they were actually in favor and vocally made this clear that they were going to accept a tax hike to create this memorial at the time. And this leads us to the American War Mothers, who at the time were a very prominent organization. They are around today. They have a headquarters in Washington, D.C. They're not very well known. The Gold Star mothers that would appear later kind of took the place, especially after the Second World War. But these American War Mothers were the mothers of sons who had either fought or died in Europe for the First World War. It was formed in 1917, actually by an Indiana resident, Alice French. So they had a vested interest in this memorial and to make a name for themselves just as much as the American Legion did. And they kind of went along, coasted on the coattails of the Legion, and they adopted their patriotic rhetoric. You can see in the newspaper article that I've included here on the screen the ideas of patriotism and honor and Americanism, which was a theme that was coming up left and right at this point. What it meant to be an American, what it meant to honor your country and to honor these veterans. And the American War Mothers also had the potential to obtain headquarters in the monument. The state government promised them that the first good vacancy would be allowed for them in addition to the American Legion. This vacancy did not take place. They did not obtain headquarters in the Indiana War Memorial, but they were still prominent in the push to get it passed in the House. In the mid-1920s, a declaration was actually passed by the Marion County government and the state government, Declaration Number 4, that the monument would be built. Finally, it had taken nearly 3 to 4 years of discussion, heavy discussion, a great deal of input from the public, and a lot of politicians gaining a bad reputation in the eyes of Indiana residents over this issue. But in 1927, as we previously discussed, the cornerstone was laid by General Pershing for the monument. It would take several years to complete. It would be completed in the 1930s, and the overall plaza would receive construction until 1950 when it was completed. The American Legion is actually not housed in the memorial anymore. They are housed in a separate national headquarters, which is next to the memorial, right off the plaza. It is in between the national or the state library as well. And there are several memorials on the grounds to other conflicts. The Indiana World War Memorial is now only known as the Indiana War Memorial because inside of it is a museum to all the conflicts that Indiana residents fought in from the colonial era to the present. So it kind of took away the specific memory of why the monument was built, but it is still evident across the facade on the outside that it is a World War memorial. And then we come to the present day with collective memory of the conflict. It is common knowledge to historians who study this that World War I is one of the forgotten wars, in addition to conflicts such as Korea, the War of 1812. And this has a lot to do with the time in which it happened. So if you think about it, these veterans came home in 1918, 1919, 1920. In less than a decade from that time, they were swept into the Great Depression. They were raising families at this time. They had to provide. And then less than a decade from that, their children are fighting a second world war, a world war that in their eyes wasn't supposed to happen. They supposedly fought the war to end all wars, and it made them feel like they fought and died for no reason whatsoever. And it was a great source of trauma for many of them, and lasting until the 60s and 70s when many of them were passing away. And like I previously said, a lot of the memory of the World War Memorial has been taken away as it has adopted meaning for additional conflicts that have taken place throughout the 20th century. Today, it is not as well known as Monument Circle, whereas it is just a few blocks away, and it is absolutely massive, far larger than the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. The grounds are beautiful. They are well kept. There are monuments everywhere. People don't go there as much as they do the tourist destination in the city. And our culture is so removed from the First World War. Richard Rubin writes that our allies at this time were a king, a czar, a crown prince. Our enemies were a sultan, a kaiser. These are terms that were utterly eliminated in European governments after this war for good reason. So to think that a conflict like that could take place just over 100 years ago, it's difficult for Americans to imagine. But with the centennial happening just a few years ago, the First World War is gaining more national recognition. Historians are focusing on the topic of collective memory of the war, as well as the aspects that made it so devastating. I appreciate you listening to my presentation. I think my time is almost up, so I will give the floor over to Grace.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for that very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions at the end of our session. Our second presenter was supposed to be Kristin Newine, but unfortunately she cannot be with us today. So we will go ahead and move to our next presenter, Grace Babcock. And let me tell you a little bit about Grace. She is an undergraduate student at Ball State University. I've had her in class. I've enjoyed that. She is majoring in history and English literature with a minor in religious studies. She has created a podcast entitled Survivalist Storytelling, Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, If This Is a Man, and the Powerful Humanity of the One Narrative. So I turn the floor over to Grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malone, and great job, Lucas. That was a really, really interesting presentation. So when I was first developing my podcast for Dr. Stoltz's History of the Holocaust class in the fall, I knew that we were tasked with trying to understand how Jewish prisoners were able to survive the brutal conditions of Auschwitz when the Nazis' sole aim was to ensure their destruction. As I was considering the text, I was really captivated by the way Levi's memoir seemed to discuss how storytelling itself is a method of survival, and how the memoir was a testament to the power of the narrative. I remembered my own experience with hearing my family's own stories, and it made me deeply consider the function of such important narratives in deeply dire situations. I realized that Levi wanted to highlight how storytelling is a method of preserving oneself and one's own humanity. And it is with that idea in mind that I created this podcast. And I'm really honored to be able to share it with you all now. So just give me a couple of seconds to share my screen and make sure everything is good to go. So here we go. Episode 1. Survival as Storytelling. Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, If This Is a Man, and the Powerful Humanity of the Narrative. The first exposure I had to the blackened history of what happened during the Holocaust was when I was 11 or 12 years old, in the form of a story told by my great-uncle Bob. I remember my father pulling me aside to listen to Uncle Bob's old war stories about his experience as an American tank driver in World War II and his memory surrounding liberating a concentration camp in Austria. His memory was cloudy and he took many pauses, but his words were clear. As my father sat and fiddled with the video camera, desperately trying to make sure every word of Uncle Bob's story was recorded, I listened carefully, painfully, to his descriptions. Looking back, I now know how privileged it is to be able to have lived in ignorance to these events for the first decade of my life, when it is an inextricable part of the Jewish community's history and their collective memory. But I will still never forget how Uncle Bob's words shook me to my core.
Yeah, it's when we drove into there, there was myself and one other tank. We drove into there, and there were just skeletons walking. They were just.
Like skeletons. I have carried his words with me for years now. They have clung to me throughout my studies and throughout my life. I have come to deeply appreciate all forms of history, but I am partial in particular to storytelling. First-hand narratives have the power to elicit incredibly strong feelings within their audience, triggering intense waves of compassion and deep-rooted human connection between listener and storyteller.
In my recent reading of Primo Levi's famous memoir, Survival in Auschwitz, If This Is a Man, storytelling becomes more than a way to convey experience, though it loses none of its emotional capabilities. It quite literally becomes an important survival strategy, a way to both physically persevere and emotionally maintain their humanity for the Jewish prisoners within the walls of the deadliest concentration camp, Auschwitz. The ability to communicate with others and commiserate in their shared experience becomes an invaluable part of their lives when faced with the brutality of the Nazi regime. In a sort of quiet rebellion against Nazi attempts to quash their spirit and strip the Jews of their humanity, Levi details how the prisoners at Auschwitz relied on telling, remembering, and sharing both their own stories and the experiences of their fellow inmates. The ability to create a narrative provided Levi and the other prisoners a way to comfort themselves in times of distress, to maintain their sense of dignity, to commiserate with one another, and to hold out hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. Levi himself also makes the argument that it is a sort of moral necessity, a way to conserve both their own legacy and remind the future generations of the suffering and strength of their ancestors. Within the pages of Survival in Auschwitz, Levi details how storytelling is a method of retaining one's humanity and developing interpersonal connection in an environment which aims to quash the dignity of Jewish prisoners. The first instance within the memoir which Levi is confronted with the power of storytelling is in his conversation with an older prisoner, Sergeant Steinlauf, in the bathroom. After having lived through the vicious attacks of Kristallnacht and subjected to the oppression and deprivation of the Nazi-sponsored ghettoization for close to a decade, the violent blow of the concentration camps made many Jewish prisoners hesitant to cling to hope, to humanity, for fear of further emotional pain and disappointment. Levi, it seemed, was hurtling towards a similar, consuming sort of surrender. At this point, Levi had been contained in Auschwitz for just over a week, and already the Nazi attempts to animalize their captives were taking advantage of his feelings of grief, exhaustion, and hunger. Levi neglected to care for himself even in what little ways he could. The instinct of cleanliness had disappeared within him as he wandered aimlessly around the washroom. Steinlauf, however, had not given up the rituals of washing himself up, even under the surveillance of both the immediate Levi's curious glances and the threat of the Nazis' caustic glare. Steinlauf reminds Levi, for all his despondency, that taking care of one's body is not a frivolous act, as the younger man calls it. In fact, he insists that those feelings of pointlessness and resignation are exactly the reactions the Nazis want to inspire in their victims. Steinlauf says it is the prisoner's responsibility to survive, to retain their humanity, and he does so by urging Levi to preserve his body and his soul in order to tell his own story.
Precisely because the logger was a great machine to reduce us to beasts, we must not become beasts. That even in this place one can survive, and therefore one must want to survive, to tell the story, to bear witness. And that to survive, we must force ourselves to save at least the skeleton, the scaffolding, the form of civilization. We are slaves deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, condemned to certain death, but we still possess one power, and we must defend it with all our strength, for it is the last, the power to refuse our consent.
Steinlauf frames the capability to bear witness to the crimes of the Holocaust as a way to gain the motivation to survive, to persevere through this unique form of Nazi torture. The camps were designed to strip these people down to their bones, to their most vulnerable selves, and crush their spirit entirely. However, the desire to live on to tell their story is a great one, for what could be more human than storytelling? As much physical deterioration and degradation these people are subject to during this brutal pogrom, the knowledge that the Nazis cannot silence their memory, their voice, and their narrative inspires strength in the previously nihilistic Levi. Though their circumstance is horrific and it is often more painful to lean into and cement the experience into memory than it is to lean back and resign, their obligation to remember is not only beneficial to their own sanity and survival, but for the future generation. The urge to pass knowledge down to possible children and grandchildren of the future in the format of a story is a uniquely human one, and, according to Levi, must be conserved. In the pages of the memoir, Levi frames this desire as an ethical duty. Stories of suffering, he argues, though they are painful, must be recorded by the survivors so their strength is not forgotten and their pain does not go unrecognized and undignified. They must fight to be able to continue to live, to write, and to tell. Levi recognizes the power that storytelling has to establish a sense of individual dignity, but also comments on its ability to be used as a tool to inspire empathy and community among the inmates. His memoir explores this capability when Levi recounts his interaction with another prisoner named Resnick. The two are forced to share their bed, yet another uncomfortable and draining tactic the Aryan Nazis used to belittle and dehumanize their so-called undesirable inmates. But they have little quarrel with one another. Resnick is tall, speaks little, and is tidy, so Levi finds nothing particularly objectionable about his new companion. However, it is through one of their few conversations that Levi reveals the unifying power of the narrative throughout the camp. Though the specifics of Resnick's story are blurry, Levi reflects on its meaning.
He told me a story, and today I've forgotten it. But it was certainly a sorrowful, cruel, and moving story, because so are all our stories. Hundreds of thousands of stories, all different and all full of tragic, disturbing necessity. We tell them to each other in the evening, and they take place in Norway, Italy, Algeria, and the Ukraine, and are simple and incomprehensible like the stories in the Bible. But are they not themselves stories of a new Bible?
In this seemingly small moment, there is a groundbreaking revelation. All the prisoners of the camp, though they have their own unique perspective, can relieve some of their pain by recognizing the suffering of other inmates, by sharing their stories and empathizing with one another. Though their backgrounds, their first languages, or their age affects their experiences in a different way, they can still commiserate with their fellow prisoners. They can still resonate with the shared experience of Nazi brutality. This is how they find one another, how they can deeply and desperately connect to one another. In a camp that is designed to tear people apart, they reach out and cling to one another by sharing their pain, by telling their stories. Each is so important, so groundbreaking, so familiar that they are compared to a new Bible, a foundational document which thousands will carry close to their hearts for generations. Their pain feels so isolating, and yet the ability to share it with another person who feels a similar kind is an immense relief. The description of this communal storytelling brings a physicality to the figures Levi interacts with. The audience is confronted with the shared, brutal reality that these people face, that these circumstances were unbelievably true and felt by many. These prisoners regain their humanity through their understanding and sympathy towards the stories of others. Each person is different, yet they can relieve their individual burdens by sharing their pain, their stories, with others. Finally, stories bring small measures of comfort to the prisoners at Auschwitz, which allowed them to develop the sense of determination necessary to their survival. Levi mentions that the prisoners, when they enter into the few hours of sleep they are allowed, begin to dream.
Behind the barely closed eyelids, dreams break out violently, the usual dreams. to be at home in a wonderfully hot bath, to be at home seated at a table, to be at home and to tell the story of this hopeless work of ours, of this never-ending hunger, of the slave's way of sleeping.
The prisoners are haunted by images of their homes, of their previous lives, but the images they create in their minds are centered around one thing: making it back to tell their families of their pain, of their Sisyphean labor and strife. The small human luxuries of the home are intoxicating to the prisoners because the Nazis have stripped them of any semblance of solace. Part of the comfort that the dreams offer, though they are painful upon waking, is the promise of community and survival. Levi frames the desire to tell stories as flint that sparks determination. The prisoners, motivated by the idea of conversing with their friends and family around the table, of releasing their pain in the form of a narrative, can find the willpower to continue to fight for survival. The promise of being able to recount their experiences carries a relieving finality, too. Being able to tell their story around the dinner table indicates that finally they are safe. Their suffering has concluded. They have healed enough to share the small pieces of their pain with their loved ones. Stories are told by the survivors, and Levi emphasizes that it becomes a necessity, an obligation to be there, to survive long enough to tell their own perspective. Storytelling unites the prisoners and reminds the audience of the memoir's insistence that there is a moral duty to continue to tell them over and over again, to grant the prisoners and the survivors the dignity they were so long deprived. The memoir itself is a testament to the power of the survival narrative and of the human compulsion to share their stories, even if they are woven with the painful threads of past atrocities. Levi is a survivor, a storyteller. He is one of the lucky few who have the opportunity and obligation to spread his own experience, to craft his own narrative. Levi survives the camps, survives the war, and his first impulse to reconcile his trauma is to write it all down, to share it. His unique experience was, is, and will be read and felt by millions of people. Levi's legacy has gained the power to survive eternally, to be held delicately and carried in the hearts and minds of generations. His painful story, both unique and similar to the hundreds of Jewish prisoners detained in Auschwitz, gains an immortal, powerful voice. Survival in Auschwitz, if this is a man itself, is evidence of the power of storytelling, for Levi urges his readers to take up the same moral responsibility to bear witness, to support the story, and to use it as a reminder of both the human capability for destruction and for perseverance. We can never understand the plight of the thousands of Jewish captives contained in concentration camps, but we can listen, we can remember, and we can retell.
Okay, so thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Grace, for that beautiful podcast. Beautiful. Okay, well, I want to make a couple of comments and pose some questions, and then we'll open the floor for audience participation. First, think about this. The first half of the 20th century was marked by 2 world wars. When we tally up the human loss from both events, the results are just staggering. I mean, it's really mind-blowing to think about how many combatants and civilians perished during those 2 cataclysmic events. And during the Second World War, we also have to remember that millions of Jewish people perished during the Holocaust. Imagine living in that time. Imagine you're living at that time and you're confronted with this harsh reality. And you can only imagine, it's not hard to imagine, that people were devastated by these unprecedented losses. I mean, it's just so staggering. And the sense of loss is so huge. Now, when we look at statistics in terms of millions, it's easy to lose sight of the individual. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that these were people with their own personal stories. And so I think that's a good way to start this sort of conversation about your papers, because you do have survivors, and in both of your papers, you're talking about survivors and how they're responding to these great losses. And both of you talk about the sense that people felt an obligation towards the dead. And I think that's a really important point that comes out in both of your papers. So the living felt a profound obligation to the dead and to remember them. But the question is, how do you do that? And I think that's a really big historical question for not only the people living at the time, but us as historians looking back. How did they do this? And I think both of your papers brought out some really fascinating aspects of the complex and complicated subject of war, memory, the title of our panel, and I would also add commemoration. So kudos to both of you, because you both took on very complex subjects, and you have presented very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations as well. And again, these are very heady, complicated subjects, and you've done a great job. Let me say a couple of comments about each of your papers and pose a question. Lucas, you gave a presentation, a subject very close to my heart as I study commemoration in Britain after World War I. And I think we would both agree that there was an unprecedented movement to commemorate the fallen of the Great War. And there was a concerted effort to pay tribute to the individual men who sacrificed their lives for the nation. And again, I want to come back to this point. You've got these huge numbers of men killed, and you don't want these men to be a statistic. And there really is a sense that the individual soldier must be recognized for his sacrifice. And so they're having to decide, how are they going to commemorate the fallen? And commemoration took many forms, including it came in the form of war memorials. And that was the subject of your beautiful PowerPoint presentation today. War memorials were erected in many places, including the Indiana World War Memorial, closer to home in Indianapolis. I really liked your presentation because I think you clearly brought out some important features of this process of creating memorials. The first is that the process of creating memorials was complex and contentious. And it's easy for us to forget that people had major disagreements about how they should proceed with commemoration. And in the extended paper that I read, you really brought out quite well the fact that there were different groups with different agendas involved in this process of commemoration. While there was a nobility to remembering the fallen, there was also a lot of dispute and contention among groups who saw this as a way to further their own agenda. I also like that you brought out very carefully the political dimension of commemoration. Again, we think of this noble task of paying tribute to the fallen, but there's a lot of politics that takes place as this is going on. And those are two major points that I think you brought out really well. Now, I was sort of thinking about commemoration in Britain as I was reading your paper, and I said, I see a lot of similarities, but I see a major difference. And there is no evidence from Britain that people use patriotism as an argument in the debate about memorials. I mean, I thought that was really fascinating. I thought it was fascinating that the American Legion of Marion County argued that opponents of the war memorial lacked Americanism. I have seen no parallel in the British discussion. And you later say that there was a newly defined ideals of Americanism that came out to play in this situation. So my question for you would be, could you say more about this new ideal of Americanism? Because I found that quite intriguing. So hold that question and we'll come back to that. But beautiful, beautiful presentation. Grace, your podcast was just wonderful. You definitely demonstrated the power of storytelling, and you definitely demonstrated the power of storytelling in many different ways. When you talked about Levi and the other inmates in the camp engaging in storytelling, you taught about what it meant to them as they're going through that experience. And I think you brought out some really fantastic points. For example, storytelling was a way for them to try to retain their dignity and humanity while they're in a system that was purposefully designed to destroy both of those things. And I think that's a really, really important point. You also brought out the point that when they told stories amongst themselves, it created a sense of community, which was also a really, really important point as well. When you read some female Holocaust survivors' accounts, they too talked to the importance of connection and community as something that enhanced their chances of survival. And I think you bring out very carefully the importance of storytelling as a survival strategy. So that's beautiful. I also like that you talked about the long-term importance of storytelling. Very clearly, you get a sense from Levi and others that they felt a moral obligation to tell their stories for those people who did not survive. And I think that comes out very nicely in your podcast, this sort of moral obligation to the dead, and that you need to tell your story, not just for yourself, but for that greater group of people who did not survive. And I think the statement that they must bear witness is a very, very important one. So that was beautiful, the way you looked at the multiple ways in which storytelling functioned within the camps and after the Holocaust. So my question for you is, why did you choose to create a podcast? Why did you choose this particular mode of communication? So we can come back to you in a moment to answer that question. So let me open the floor to Lucas and see if he has anything to say about this term of Americanism.
Thank you, Dr. Malone. Yeah, this term of Americanism came up quite a bit in my research for this topic, not only from the American Legion, but as I said in my presentation, from the American War Mothers, who adopted the same language used as the American Legion. And it has a lot to do with this idea of American identity, this national identity that has been associated with war since before the nation was founded. Jill Lepore writes in her book, The Name of War, that American identity can be traced back to the conflict of King Philip's War in the 17th century. And this idea of exceptionalism as well, that Americans are the city on a hill, as John Winthrop put it. The entire world looks to our country for guidance and for moral values to see what is the right thing to do. And this idea has carried on. It carried on through the 19th century with Manifest Destiny. It carried straight on through to the 20th century when it came to global conflict. And it was prominently thought, and it still is today, that the Europeans, the continent of Europe was a mess. Europeans couldn't get the war together, and that America had to step in almost in the eyes of Americans to kind of guide them back to peace and democracy. And especially after Woodrow Wilson, pushed for his League of Nations, and you start to see empires of Europe dismantling, such as the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians. Monarchies are falling, as they did in Germany, and this democratic system of government, this Republican system of government, is stepping in. Americans thought, we did that. We stepped in 1917. Now, while that is highly contested by historians today, for obvious reasons, this is their mindset. And as the American Legion emerged towards the tail end of the war and in 1919, they felt that they had to do something about the unrest that they were still seeing. As I mentioned, these veterans thought that they had fought the war to end all wars. That's the way it was portrayed for years in Europe and here. And as we see Russia drop out of the conflict throughout their civil war, and we see the rise of the Bolshevik army and communism start to spread throughout Europe, it created a great fear. The Red Scare was not just in the 50s, the Red Scare was also in the teens and 20s, and arguably more prominent at that time as communist parties in the United States and in Europe were gaining votes rapidly. There was a lot of discontent with the capitalist system. You see labor strikes and unrest throughout the 19th century. The working class was fed up with the way things were. And the American Legion saw this opportunity, as well as other organizations such as the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Knights of Columbus, and whatnot. They felt that this was an opportunity to really push this American identity that had been around for centuries back into the eyes of the public and finally gain some traction in the government with what to do through lobbying. So yeah, it was a really fascinating topic, and it was always a term that I had heard about in the past, but I wasn't too clear on the Legion's impact of it. And the Legion is really the one who coined the term Americanism, and it is published in newspapers for the rest of the century, especially during this time period after the Second World War, when the Legion really had some power of government lobbying. Americanism, that was a term that everyone knew. And they really knew how to pull on the heartstrings of the American public. They used terms such as honor and valor and sacrifice, speaking to mothers directly through newspapers saying, you are the ones who have suffered the most by your children's sacrifice overseas for democracy. Your children died to preserve this system of government that we have, and that we are blessed to have. And that resonated with a lot of people across the country. So it wasn't difficult to imagine that when the idea of a war memorial was proposed by the American Legion and by the public, that it was going to have the full backing, regardless of cost, regardless of location, which are the issues that the state government had with it. It was going to happen. It was going to happen one way or another.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Very interesting. Great. How about you, Grace? And then answer my question about the podcast format.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think it's really interesting that you identified and really resonated with the part about how it's a moral obligation and how there is a sort of ethical duty, as Levi frames it, to tell stories, because many Jewish survivors chose not to tell their stories and chose to just kind of want to move on, to not document such brutality, because of whether it was too traumatic for them to retell, whether it was just too brutal for them to widely publish, things like that. There were many decisions that went into the decision to write narratives down, to speak about them. And in Levi's case, he did choose to commemorate his experience in the form of a text. And I think that was very, very important. It has sold millions of copies across the whole world, really. But the reason that I chose to do a podcast rather than just a paper is because I think there's a lot to be said for this transition into the digital era, right? Especially now. And I think it's becoming increasingly important to increase accessibility to these narratives, especially creating them in different formats. So this is not to say that writing things down isn't important and won't reach a wide audience. But I think there is a lot of merit to hearing someone's voice and hearing the testimony from a firsthand audience, if that's still possible. But podcasts, you know, you can access those on YouTube, on Spotify, and a bunch of different platforms that are very widely accessible to a large audience. And so even though mine isn't like professional and won't be accessible on like apps or anything like that, I thought it was really interesting to kind of play with this idea of an oral history, and to kind of continue that legacy in a new format, in the format of a podcast that's digital and accessible and easily heard and listened to. So that's part of my reasoning.
Well, it occurred to me that you're being a storyteller, and you're using the new technology that's available to you to be a storyteller, to bring somebody else's story to a larger audience. Very nice, very nice. Well, let me go into the Q&A and see if we have any questions from our audience. We do not currently have any questions. Maybe we can give our audience a little more time to think about things. While they're doing that, can I maybe follow up with some of your answers? And let me maybe go back to Lucas and see if I can ask him to say a little bit more about one of the points that he made. It is very interesting that you point out the fear of communism after World War I, because we do typically think of the Red Scare of a later period. Do you think the creation of memorials like the Indiana Memorial was meant to quell those kinds of sentiments? Could you see it serving a political function in that way?
Most certainly, it served a political function, especially from those organizations like the Legion and the War Mothers, as well as the public who were worried at the growing unrest. When we think of times of peace after such incredible conflicts, it's supposed to be peaceful. It's supposed to be a time of resolution and unity, and that was not the case. We saw that after the Civil War with Reconstruction, and they saw it once again after the First World War across Europe. Nations had a vendetta out against Germany and the other enemies of the Allies, and they were going to get their revenge. But there was a deep-seated fear of what was happening in Russia at that time. Communism and socialism, they weren't new to the United States. They had been around and had quite a voice throughout the 19th century, especially when it came to labor movements. But there was growing fears about what it could do to a capitalistic society, a democratic society at the time from self-deemed patriotic organizations. And yeah, I would say that the American public recognized that by promoting such a massive monument, that they would be bolstering patriotic ideas, bolstering ideas of honor, and this newly created term of Americanism that surely would kind of squash some of those socialist sentiments that were spreading around the world at that time.
That's very interesting, because in Britain, historians have argued commemoration functioned to quell criticisms of the war and also criticisms of what was happening in post-war society. So it sort of takes on another life of its own beyond remembering the men who died. It serves a social function for those who are living through the post-World War I world and all of its problems. Yeah, great.
And this idea of the anti-war sentiments after the war, as I mentioned with Lou Shank, the representative from Indiana, who was against the memorial based on financials and location, those articles that the public wrote against him make it very clear that they were not having any sort of anti-war sentiment. They recognized the sacrifices that their loved ones had made in Europe, and they were not going to acknowledge or tolerate any anti-war sentiments anymore. Obviously, there was during the conflict the idea of isolationism beforehand, that Wilson had to struggle with from the government and the public. There was senses of isolationism, but they were not going to tolerate the idea that the war was useless. We shouldn't have got involved in it, because they could always look back and point to the numbers, point to the 117,000 American soldiers who perished, the hundreds of thousands more who had mental trauma, physical ailments, things of that nature.
So we still don't have any questions. So maybe I'll throw out a general question for both of our panelists. And I think it's interesting that we're with the subject of memory. You have individual memory and you have collective memory. Do you have any thoughts about how those two things fit into your particular topics, the relationship between individual memory and collective memory? Oh yes, that's not a hard question, a challenging, probing question to ask on a Thursday morning, but.
Well, I think it's really interesting that in Levi's memoir, it's his own story. He's explaining what he went through in a very deeply personal lens. And so the entire narrative is structured around what he came into contact with. But at that same time, he makes a very distinct point to incorporate stories of other people and stories that people he came into contact with told him. And I think that's in part to convey the humanity of these people, to reemphasize that these people suffered and that these people were still able to persevere. And so I think it's really interesting to consider how even in one person's story, there are so many perspectives that impact our historical knowledge and impact our memory. That even one person's memory is tied to hundreds of others.
Well, thank you. It's very interesting.
I have to agree with Grace on that. It's interesting to see the multitude of perspectives that get tied in with just one account. I think that one of the issues with this idea of individual memory is its association with trauma and suffering. People's willingness to share their own stories after a conflict or after an event as horrific as the Holocaust. We think of Second World War veterans who came home who didn't speak about it at all. I actually spoke to a veteran's son a few days ago who his father landed on Utah on D-Day. And they said that when he came home from the war, he hung up his uniform and he went back to work the very next day after he was discharged. And he never spoke to his family about anything. They didn't know that he was wounded 4 times until they found his Purple Hearts when they were cleaning the house after his funeral. And a lot can be said of that taking place with World War I veterans as well. I mentioned in my presentation, they didn't have time to think. They didn't have time to consider this. Within 20 years, they had to deal with the rise of fascism in Europe. The economy was decimated. They were having families, raising their children, and then they watched those children go off to fight an even more horrific war in the same place where they were a few years prior. And that is disheartening. That makes you wonder why you were there. What was the point? Why did you witness so much carnage? And I think a lot about what inspired me to really get involved with World War I studies was stories of my great-grandfather, who was a medic on the front lines in Field Hospital Number 3, 1st Division. And he would share, I did not know him, but he would share very little bits of information with relatives, but he wouldn't really speak about it. Even his brother, who was a courier for President Roosevelt's son, he was gassed twice and shot and didn't really speak about it. I didn't learn about this information until I looked up newspaper records of them. So you really have to rely on this collective memory, and it's interesting to note that collective memory of a conflict is driven by public opinion more so than the opinion of the veterans, who arguably should have far more say in the matter than anyone. The public who did not fight they're the ones that control the historical narrative. This was the case after the Civil War as well, and it has not gone away at all. And we think a lot about erasure as well when you think about collective memory and the merging of conflicts all kind of lumped into one, and that takes away a lot from veterans' experiences. Just no different than the Indiana World War Memorial now becoming the Indiana War Memorial. And although those veterans are no longer around to make a statement about it, it takes away from what they went through by lumping all 20th century conflicts into one memorial that was built for a very specific reason. And I think with the emergence of memory studies over the last 30 years, historians are really starting to piece together what that means and what can be done better by governments and the public to honor those who served.
Thank you both for those great answers. We have a question.
You're muted, Carolyn.
Yep, thank you. Let me read this question for Lucas. Considering that there are no longer any World War I survivors, how can we continue to keep this history alive and reawaken a sense of patriotism to remember the past while history is being torn down all around us? We must not forget those who gave all.
So that question goes in, it's very pertinent today. There's a lot of politics surrounding the removal of monuments, something that I'm not willing to get into right now, but I will speak to the fact that, we can do a better job of remembering World War I sacrifice. And this was a question that Richard Rubin, who I briefly brought up in my presentation, thought of about 20 years ago in the late 90s and early 2000s. And he remembered a time in the 1970s when his mother took him to a nursing home. I don't remember where he lived, but his mother took him to a nursing home, and he saw these old disabled veterans. And he asked his mother who they were, what were they from? And she said those are World War I veterans. And this was just an unimaginable thing for him. And you have to think this is only a little over 50 years removed from the conflict. Not a very long time, but it was still unimaginable to him that those veterans could still be alive. That is from such a distant past era, a time that is utterly, old, non-modern in any way whatsoever. And that's something he carried with him his entire life. And actually in the early 2000s, he tracked down several veterans of the First World War, the last surviving ones in the United States, all of which were well over 100 years old, utterly ignored by the public. And he recorded all of their stories. And we're very fortunate to still have a great deal of oral histories that had taken place from the 1950s forward until all of them passed away, from not just from the United States, but also overseas. We think of, there was a documentary that came out a few years ago that recounted the stories of, I believe it was only British survivors of the conflict. So we can learn quite a bit from these oral histories. The problem is people in the modern day don't want to watch those. And I think that's why it's great that people like Grace can create these podcasts that incorporate oral histories and oral topics, because that really disseminates the information for a far younger audience than, older historians or people that like to sit in dusty archives and read documents and watch old footage. And I think that is a topic that is really going to, as we emerge in the digital age, it's really going to come to the forefront of history. It already has to an extent. A second thing that can be done better is government commemoration of the conflict. In 2004, we saw the World War II memorial being built and erected in Washington, D.C. The Vietnam Memorial has been around for a long time. There's one to Korea. There actually isn't a World War I memorial as we like to think about it. There is a park in Washington, D.C., Pershing Park, that is being, rather than the national government creating a separate memorial, they are converting this existing park into a World War I memorial to an extent. Some feel that it is disrespectful that they would not build something different and that they are just simply revitalizing an existing park. Some feel like it's doing enough because those veterans are no longer around. So that issue of remembering World War I veterans and keeping that patriotism alive is something that is currently being written about quite a bit. This issue is not, it's not going to see an end for quite some time. And I wish I had a conclusive answer. I'm only a graduate student. I'm not some, man of wisdom who can tell you this is what we need to do. But there are a lot of historians that are trying to figure that out currently.
Without taking too much time, I would like to just jump in to answer the part of the question that Lucas identified and probably smarter than me didn't want to get into. I think one of the things about Lucas's paper and about Grace's presentation, one of the things that both of those show us really well is that memorialization is never apolitical, right? It's never just history. The stories that we tell about the past are always sort of premised on who and what we want to remember. And so when we're looking at monuments being torn down and controversies surrounding those, I would really encourage us to think like historians in the sense of not taking for granted that the monument is the past, but looking at what the history of that monument was. What was the purpose of it? What was the particular kind of inclusion of the community and exclusions that were being communicated by those monuments? And again, I don't want to take up too much time, but I just sort of wanted to put those questions out there.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was a very good point. Let me go to Q&A. I think there's another question. Hold on. This is a question for Grace. Do you think that storytelling or telling the stories of atrocities, such as those by Primo Levi experience, simply perpetuates anti-Semitism? Why or why not?
I think that's a really, really good question and a very complicated one. As I said before, many Jewish survivors chose not to tell their stories for that purpose. They didn't want to continue to permeate Nazi ideas. They didn't want to continue to dwell on this very, very hate-driven and systemic prejudice against the Jewish people. They just kind of wanted to begin to develop new narratives surrounding the Jewish community. They didn't want to dwell in that atrocity. And I think the only way to answer it is really to say that in Levi's case, and in many cases of survivors who made that decision to tell their story, is that they have control of it. They have control of what they want to say, and they are personally speaking of their own experience. And I think that's really, really valuable when we consider that the Nazis' goal and the goal of anti-Semitism is to eliminate a Jewish voice and to eliminate that perspective. And so even though this content deals with persecution of the Jewish people and anti-Semitic ideology, I think granting that control to survivors, to the Jewish community, is really essential so their perspective does not get silenced and does not get forgotten by history or ignored or overstepped. So even though there is that risk of continuing to permeate these ideas, there's also a benefit because that places control in the hands of the people who suffered from that ideology.
Thank you. I think that brings up the important point of agency in history. allowing people to have agency to tell their story so they are not just simply dismissed or marginalized. We do not have any other questions. So do you two want to say anything else, Lucas or Grace?
I mean, I'd just like to thank everyone for the questions, especially you, Dr. Malone. I think that we had a very brief time to give our presentations here, and I really just gave a summary of everything. And by asking those questions, you really allowed me to dive into some of the information. I think that this idea of agency, of storytelling, it's very important. Commemoration comes in a lot of different fashions. It's not just a massive monument that we see in downtown Indianapolis. It's a book or a manuscript, just like Grace presented over. There's a lot of different ways to tell individual stories. And I think they all deserve recognition. And I'm happy to see that they are in the present day being converted more into digital formats so that people can read them more and recognize them more. And yeah, I just think it's very exciting, the benefits that technology can provide to historians now in the way that we remember things.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to speak to you all and to present over these topics. I would agree with everything Lucas said. I think it's really essential that we continue to have these conversations and continue to be speaking about this, because as we get farther and farther away from these events, we still need to ensure that we're remembering them with as much accuracy and as much compassion and as much information and informative perspective as we can. So I really have appreciated this time and appreciated all of this conversation that we had. I think it's really essential moving forward.
Can I ask you a question, Grace? What are your plans with your podcast?
Right now it's unlisted, so anyone with the link can view it. I can put it in the chat. But as of right now, I think I may try to pursue podcast projects in the future. I think it's a really interesting and engaging way to interact with history. I know Dr. Soltz could tell you a lot about the values of public history as a medium and as a historical pursuit, but yeah, I can leave that link if anyone's interested in there. But yeah, I really enjoyed that experience of getting to make that, and I did kind of have to stumble. Oh, I think that just went out to the panelists. Let me do. Oh, I think I can. Oh, panelists and attendees. Okay. There we go. But it was interesting to try to navigate that process, because I recorded it on my phone. I edited it with pre-installed software, but it was really interesting to kind of piece through that, and I think it was really meaningful to me to be able to integrate some of my own family's perspective with that liberation, with Uncle Bob's experience in World War II as a soldier. And so it was really rewarding to really engage with that content on that level. It was something that I hadn't done before and that I was really grateful to be able to experience.
Well, I just really want to thank Lucas and Grace for their excellent work. You are really engaging in important scholarship, and it's very complex and complicated, but in the end, it's also very meaningful. So thank you both very much for your presentations today.